Well, hello again, everyone, and welcome back to this series of brief video presentations introducing some of the stories we will be reading from now until the end of the semester. In this presentation, I want to talk about the story for next week, The Writing of the God. This story is sometimes also translated into English as God's Script, so just know you may also see it referred to under that title. Both of these are perfectly adequate translations of the Spanish original, La Escritura del Dios. The Writing of the God was originally published in 1949 in a very important Argentine literary magazine called Sur, which just means South. And then it was reprinted a couple of months later in Borges' second major collection of short stories called the Aleph. Yeah. In this presentation, I want to sort of follow the trajectory of the previous presentations and talk about the Writing of the God in terms of genre. So you recall that we talked about Death in the Compass as an example of detective fiction. We talked about The Garden of Forking Paths as an example of espionage fiction. I want to apply a similar analytical technique to the Writing of the God, at least for this first presentation. Since I'm going to be making a relatively broad range of references, I thought it might be useful to share my screen with you so that you can have a kind of visual cue to accompany what it is that I'm saying. So I'm going to do that. And then we will talk about the genre of the Writing of the God. So you can see here on the screen, as I mentioned, the Writing of the God was first published in 1949 in a literary magazine and then reprinted as part of this collection, El Aleph. What are we to say about the genre of the Writing of the God? This seems to me a relatively complicated question that we can approach from a variety of different angles. On the one hand, we might think of the Writing of the God as an example of historical fiction. After all, it is set in a specific and readily identifiable historical context, Mexico, or what was called then New Spain, in the years immediately following the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, so the early to middle years of the 1520s. It also features characters who were themselves actually existing historical personages. So for instance, the Pedro de Alvarado, who is mentioned on the first page of the story, was himself an actual Spanish conquistador who accompanied Cortés in his 1519 expedition to Mexico and then assisted in the conquest of the Aztecs, which culminated in 1521. Alvarado was eventually in 1527 made governor of Guatemala. During his lifetime, as the story implies, Alvarado was known for his cruelty, his brutality, his bloodlust, his sort of generalized psychopathy. In fact, the most recent article I read about Alvarado was called precisely Pedro de Alvarado, el psicópata en las filas de Cortés. So Pedro de Alvarado, the psychopath in Cortés's ranks. And yet, despite these gestures in the direction of historical fiction, despite the readily identifiable historical context and the actually existing historical personages, it's also clear that Borges is not, in fact, interested in writing a sort of full-dress instance of historical fiction. He's not interested in recreating in any detail or with any degree of fidelity the historical context to which he alludes and in which his story is set. So there are gestures in the direction of historical fiction, but it would be inappropriate, I think, to call it historical fiction in a straightforward or unproblematic sense. In addition to historical fiction, I think we can also think of the Writing of the God as an example of fantasy fiction. So here are some examples of fantasy fiction. I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with these examples. You're probably also familiar with fantasy fiction as a genre. I mean, fantasy does precisely what its name suggests. It includes elements, characters, events that are fantastical, that is to say, supernatural, magical. Fantasy fiction involves or includes things that do not or cannot, or at least are thought not to be able to occur in the actual world. And in one sense, at least, the Writing of the God belongs to this genre. The idea, for instance, that an Aztec priest could utter a magical supernatural incantation and thereby overthrow the conquest of the Aztecs makes the story, at least in this sense, an example of fantastical fiction. Now, what happens when we combine, on the one hand, a certain attention to historical detail, a certain realism, with, on the other hand, fantastical elements? Well, lots of different things. But in Latin America, one result of this combination has come to be called magical realism. Now, I assume that many of you are familiar with magical realism. Many of you may have had the opportunity to read examples of magical realism. If you had the great pleasure of taking Spanish 310 with me, you had the opportunity to read at least 2 examples of magical realism. And magical realism is what its name implies, an attempt to blend the magical and the realistic. That is to say, generally by introducing or inserting magical, supernatural, fantastical elements into an otherwise realistic narrative frame. I was actually looking around on Google Images for another presentation and ran across this image. Maybe it's not a meme exactly, but it defines magical realism as follows. All the banalities of daily life, but it's raining flowers and someone married a tiger. Now, clearly this is supposed to be a kind of cheeky definition of magical realism, but it in some ways gets to the heart of the matter. On the one hand, magical realism is committed to the realistic, the ordinary, the banal, what it means to live a normal human life. And yet, on the other hand, in the midst of the banality, the ordinariness of daily life, weird things happen. So you know that you're reading an example of magical realism if all of the characters seem perfectly normal, perfectly human, and then you suddenly discover that one of them is 1,500 years old. You know you're reading an example of magical realism if all the characters seem normal and human, and then suddenly one of them sprouts wings and flies away. Yeah? So this is sort of the way that magical realism works, to combine on the one hand the realistic and on the other hand the magical. Now, magical realism is and has been a defining genre of Latin American literature. Probably for the last 70 or 80 years, it has been Latin America's primary literary export. It is, at least outside of Latin America, associated with Latin America, at least with Latin American literary culture. Within Latin America, magical realism sort of begins to develop in the 1930s and 1940s as an outgrowth of the avant-garde movement. It doesn't really come to its full flower until the late 1950s through, say, the early 1970s, but there are some important predecessors, some forerunners of magical realism. One author who's generally credited as a forerunner and an important theorist of magical realism is the Cuban novelist Alejo Carpentier. He's on the screen here, as you can see. His 1949 novel, The Kingdom of This World, is sometimes thought to be the first sort of self-consciously magical realist novel written in Latin America. The Kingdom of This World is set in the late 18th century, specifically in 1791 during the Haitian slave revolt. So it's tied to a particular historical context. And yes, yet within this particular historical context, weird things happen. Teleportation, time travel, things of this nature. The Kingdom of This World is also important because it included the first attempt to theorize, or one of the first influential attempts to theorize, what Carpentier called lo real maravilloso, the marvelous real, which came to be the kind of conceptual framework for magical realism as it would develop in the 60s and 70s. In addition to Carpentier, Borges himself is widely considered a forerunner, if not exactly a practitioner, of magical realism. And having read many of his stories, I think you can probably begin to understand why. So, some important forerunners. Magical realism, properly so called, however, really doesn't begin, as I was saying, until the late 1950s and then through the 1960s. Then it begins to sort of taper off in the 1970s. Some important novelists and writers that we want to keep in mind. This fellow, Julio Cortázar, who was an Argentine novelist and short story writer, actually spent most of his life in Paris and did most of his writing in Paris. A very important exponent of magical realism, probably best known for his novel Rayuela, which you can see on the screen and probably can also deduce that the word Rayuela in Spanish means hopscotch in English. Another example of magical realism in Latin America is this fellow, José Donoso, a Chilean novelist. His most important novel, the novel for which he is best known, is here on the screen, El obsceno pájaro de la noche, The Obscene Bird of the Night. It's a fantastic novel. It's also one of the strangest, weirdest, most mind-bending novels I've ever read, but also one of my favorites. So Donoso, an important exponent of magical realism in Latin America. Maybe unlike some other magical realist novels, I'll just add as a kind of aside, Donoso's magical realism is tinged with certain elements of horror. as well. This is sometimes the case in magical realism, but not always, and probably not often. There are other novelists that we might want to keep in mind as well. For instance, Carlos Fuentes, the great Mexican novelist, comes to mind as an important exponent of magical realism. In addition to all of these novelists, however, the preeminent example, the preeminent instance of magical realism in Latin America is, without any doubt, this fellow, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the great Colombian novelist whose 1967 novel, 100 Years of Solitude, is forever and all time the paradigmatic instance of magical realism in Latin America. This is the sort of novel that will be read and talked about in 1,000, 2,000 years, assuming there are people who can read in 2,000 years. It's also the one magical realist novel that you ought to read. If you only have a chance to read one magical realist novel, you have to read this one. It's that important. Okay, so a little bit about the history of magical realism, its development, some of its principal theorists and exponents in Latin America, at least. This brings us to the final question I want to consider in this presentation. Is the writing of the god an instance of magical realism? Well, to be honest, I'm of two minds about this question. On the one hand, I'm inclined to say that it is an example of magical realism. After all, it does what magical realists do. It combines, on the one hand, a certain kind of attention to realism, to historical detail, with elements of the fantastical, the magical, and the supernatural. So in that sense, I think it's reasonable to see it as an example of magical realism. And yet, on the other hand, I'm skeptical. I'm hesitant to include it unproblematically in this genre. Recall the meme from earlier. Recall the image from earlier, defining magical realism as containing all the banalities of daily life, but it's raining flowers and someone married a tiger. One might wonder whether the writing of the god indeed contains sufficiently many instances of the banality of daily life to count as an example of magical realism. Is it really describing the ordinariness of human existence, the banality of human existence, and does it do this to a sufficiently high degree to count as an example of magical realism? And my inclination is to say that it doesn't, and so it is not, for that reason, an example of magical realism in the fully developed sense that we will see in someone like Garcia Marquez, and someone like Donoso, and someone like Carlos Fuentes. And yet, even if the writing of the god does not belong to magical realism properly, it is reasonable and important to see it as a forerunner of magical realism. It's one of the texts that all of the magical realist novelists, properly so called, would have been familiar with, and paved the way for the full florescence of that genre in the 1960s and 1970s. Okay, so a little bit about magical realism, a little bit about the writing of the god and its place in the genre of magical realism. In the next presentation, I want to try to connect the idea of the fantastical or the magical in the writing of the god with another key theme of the story, and that is, of course, the religious or mystical theme. So stay tuned. If you have any questions, as always, let us know. We're here to help. Enjoy your reading, and bye-bye.